the fourth installment of our series on the First Amendment, generously funded by the Kirby Foundation. It is always a pleasure to introduce a friend and someone I know and someone I respect, and that's why it's such a great thrill, yet again, to be introducing Nadia Brown, professor of government at Georgetown University, recently arrived from Purdue University. She is the chair of the Women's and Gender Studies program. She's also an affiliate in the African American Studies program, and she specializes in Black women's politics. Her research interests are in identity politics, legislative studies, and Black women's studies. While she's trained as a political scientist, her scholarship is on the notion of intersectionality, which seeks to push beyond disciplinary constraints to think more holistically about the politics of identity. Her books are several and growing every single year. She has many projects in the pipeline. She wrote Sisters in the State House. I love that title. Black Women in Legislative Decision Making, Oxford University Press. She wrote with Danielle Lemmy, Sister Style, The Politics of Appearance for Black Women Political Elites. And she was mentioning earlier, she co-authored and edited readings, The Politics of Protest, readings on Black Lives Matter movement. But I came to know her as our co-author with Sarah Gershon and Larry Berman on our textbook, Approaching Democracy, American Government in Times of Challenge, which is in the 9th edition and about to go into the 10th edition. We'll be working on that for next year. We're really looking forward to that. It is always a pleasure to see you, Professor Brown, and I'm very anxious to hear what you have to say. Thank you for joining us again. I know it's a busy time, and we appreciate your time.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Ryan. It's always delightful to talk with you. And it's a highlight. So, and the other thing I'll mention before I start sharing, that I really want to be a resource. So if you have follow-up questions, wholehearted disagreements, concerns, looking for resources for your class, please reach out to me. I should share my screen now. So here's the way to get me. I'm nadia.brown@georgetown.edu. And you can also follow me on Twitter, Brown PhD Girl, and engage with me there. So I'm going to talk today, probably do more talking at you than with you for a bit, and then hope that we can have a kind of a robust conversation, and where I might be able to answer questions that would be of use for you as trying to kind of incorporate some of this material into your class. So bear with me, because it's going to be like information overload again on a Tuesday night. So do what you can, but this will be recorded, and I'm happy to also share slides and other kind of resources if you're interested. Other thing to note, I'm using 2 screens, so I apologize if like my transitions aren't as smooth. It's just been 2 years of being right on Zoom with the pandemic, and I'm still getting used to things. All right, so what I want to lead us off with is thinking about race and the Constitution. And I do this for 2 reasons. One, because I want to show you this like kind of path-dependent argument about how political scientists or government and structures and institutions work to maintain racial hierarchies. And so I'm giving you kind of like the aha moment up front, but like stay with me for a while, right? So race in the Constitution is something that legal scholars have and political scientists have debated for centuries now, right? for a very long time. But the part that I want us to walk away with is that the founding of our nation is a good place for us to look at how racism and race developed in our country. So this is not topics or conversations that are new to us in the United States. These are not topics that our forefathers and mothers haven't grappled with in the past, right? The difference is in our political time, people don't want to have that kind of conversation. Or perhaps I'll say the difference is, but like, we don't want to recognize that these are challenges that people like Jane Madison and Alexander Hamilton and John Hancock also troubled with. And then I want to lead us to talking about, so what happens if we fail to talk about race? If we just want to push this under the rug and say that race and racism is not something that is part and parcel of the American founding project. We have issues like we're having today, right? And issues that we've been having all throughout the founding of the United States. What makes it different today is the Black Lives Matter protest movement is the largest mass demonstration in the United States history, right? And so anytime that there is another shooting of an unarmed Black person by the police or any other paramilitary organization, there's outcry in the streets now. There's a disturbing trail of destruction that often happens after these demonstrations that somehow seek to overshadow the message that we need to think about racism and race in the United States. And I argue, right, that America has yet to have this honest conversation about race and racism. But that's because the framers themselves punted on this question of race, right, and what to do with Black people, and what to do with people in the United States from Africa. And so the way that the framers dealt with this is a legacy of like why we are still dealing with this, right? And so I'll give it an example I usually share with my students. It's like if you build you buy a house, a beautiful old house, and the foundation is cracked and faulty, but the inside is beautiful, right? And then you might come in and put up some new wallpaper or switch out the stove or put on some new curtains or expand, the ensuite and the master or the owner's suite. But the foundation is still cracked and you don't address the foundation, you will have problems with this house. And this is the same thing, right? The United States, we have fully, chosen not to address race in a systematic and racism in a systematic way. And because of that, we are dealing with a house that looks beautiful on the outside, right? It's a shining beacon of light on a hill for others to see. But inside, there are some deep issues that need to be resolved. So one of these issues is like the Constitution, right? And so legal scholars argue that the Constitution is actually pro-slavery if it's not ambiguous to slavery. And let me walk you through this, right? So out of the 11 clauses in the Constitution that deal or have any kind of policy implications for slavery, 10 protect slavery, slaves as property and the power of masters. And only one of these clauses, it's the International Slave Trade Clause, points to the possible future power by which after 20 years, slavery can be curtailed, right? And so on the balance, right, the Constitution seems pretty ambiguous, but in like reality and operationally, it's actually pro-slavery. So give an example, right? The 3/5 compromise, and this is a compromise I'm sure you all are aware of, the agreement between the delegates and the northern and southern states at the United States Constitution that there would be 3/5 state slaves population would be counted for determining direct taxation and representation in the House of Representatives. And so by this clause, those that were enslaved were able to add to the count of those to be represented, not to be represented, but add to the count in the House of Representatives. So those that lived in slaveholding states would have more representation because they're able to count bodies that aren't actually citizens or people that are voting or have full rights and privileges in the United States. Furthermore, right, the Constitution protects slavery by increasing the political representation for slave owners and slave states. And then, although it limited congressional power to kind of regulate international slave trade, but what it also did was it protected the rights of enslavers so that the federal government, I'll talk a little bit about this towards the Dred Scott decision, the Missouri Compromise, right? The federal government then gets involved and says that they have the responsibility to return fugitive slaves. So this is what happens then. The framers didn't want to have this conversation. They punted on this, right? The Constitution looks on face value kind of ambiguous, but really, there's only one clause in the Constitution that that doesn't deal with supporting enslavement. And so this picture here on the bottom of the 1790 census is these northern states that, yes, had slavery, right? But in those states, there were 1.8 million. Now take just these, 5 southern states out of the other states that you see here in this picture, were able to have larger representation because of the enslaved population, not because of the larger number of free whites or those that were determined to be citizens at the time. And so what I propose is that we also don't want to have this conversation, right? The framers didn't want to have it. We in the United States don't want to have it. And just take, for example, right, what's happening now in public education. Right, there's this backlash towards critical race theory that, sidebar, right, political scientists and education policy specialists have well documented that critical race theory is actually not taught in schools in elementary K through 12. I'm a political scientist professor. I don't really teach critical race theory either, right? It's something that usually is in the domain of law schools. But this is a big deal, right? This is a rallying cry for state and local control over school boards and public education. The other thing to take about this is what's happening now, as there's a large banning of books in public education, right, of schools, where parents are, particularly conservative parents, are saying they don't want certain pieces of literature to be read that were previously in library books and library shelves because they might raise uncomfortable imagery for students, such as enslavement or rape, like getting rid of Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, or trying to curtail works by queer and LGBTQ authors about the experiences of being LGBTQ in the United States. And we don't have these conversations because they're difficult. They make people uncomfortable. But what I want to do is think with you about how to have these conversations, right? And that, from my vantage point, to have these conversations, it is best to start with a set of objective understandings, right? Based on social science, to share with parents, to share with students, to share with colleagues, right? To start the conversation. It's not about race. It's about racism. And there's a big difference, right? And I want to really push that point home. And so the tools that I want us to think through today are like, how do we have this conversation? It's difficult. We don't like having difficult conversations. The framers didn't like having difficult conversations. They punted. But we can have these. And so I hope to talk us through that. So kind of leading to this big point, the big picture here is that racism is not about individual actions or thoughts. Right? So we have to dissolve ourselves of this notion that someone is racist in one particular point in time, or that someone did something racist or said something racist, but they are not racist. And really, like all of these things are logic that we hear being discussed in the popular mainstream. But what I want to remind us is that racism is structural, institutional, cultural, intersectional. It's not just about one individual deed, right? So in social science literature, racism is prejudice plus power. So if you have the power to change or structure or animate someone's lived experiences, and you have a prejudice, you have a bias, you have stereotypes about a certain group of people, that is racism, right? So yes, it is important to call out, right, someone who says something racist or does something racist. But it's even more important to think about these larger structures that animate American society that are rooted in racial inequality. And that's racism, right? That's what I really want us to talk about. And so that form of racism lies underneath, all around, and across society. It encompasses history. It lies underneath providing the foundation for white supremacy, white supremacy in this country. It has to do with culture, right? So all the ways that we live our everyday lives and the things that we think are normal here, right, particularly in the United States, are rooted in racism and the replication of racism. And then also, right, there's interconnectedness between institutions and policies. So it's not just, right, that Congress is an institution that was founded on unequal representation, but the people that make up members of Congress today are most likely coming from a certain demographic group and are passing policies that favor a certain demographic group. So all of these things, right, work together to legitimize racism and to reinforce racism, perpetuate racism without even, without even calling out racism. And so for those of you before the pandemic used to travel and go to go to other countries, you can point out things in another society because you are new to that society, right? You haven't grown up in that culture or that system. And the things that you see in that society are things that you're blind to seeing here. And racism is that, right? So for social scientists, we see a racism as American as apple pie, right? And calling out racism then becomes the racist thing to do, right? Because it's so deeply entrenched and baked in to our society. Okay, the next slide, I just walked you through this path-dependent argument on these congressional deliberations on race. So as I was stating earlier, right, the founders didn't talk about race. The United States didn't meaningfully talk about race, right? They punt, at least with the embargo and trying to end international slave trade for 20 years after the Constitution was founded. But then what does the U.S. do then, right? And so there becomes a dispute between enslaved states and free states. And a series of laws were passed in 1820 and 1821 that really put the nation on this collision course, right? Of were we going to be a free state or a free nation or a nation with slavery? And so what the United States Congress decides to do is the Missouri Compromise, right? They admit Missouri as a slaveholding state and they admit Maine as a free state. And then they prohibited slavery in any territory that would later become Kansas and Nebraska. But what kind of sets this, this Missouri Compromise off balance 30 years later is the Fugitive Slave Act. And that happened in 1850. And that was part of the Compromise of 1850. And this act required that slaves be returned to their owners, even if they were in a free state. And so this act made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying escaped slaves. So the balance of power has shifted here. So this leads us to the Dred Scott decision. So the Supreme Court ruled on March 6, 1857, that Dred Scott, having lived in a free state and territory, did not entitle the enslaved person to his freedom. So in essence, the decision argued that as someone's property, Scott and his family were not a citizen and therefore could not sue in court. And this is like, we're off to the Civil War, right? Because there are two different fractions here. And if there are people in the United States that are deemed inherently not a citizen, even if they live in a free state, right? And even if they are in limited capacities, right, serving as citizens, the government now has overreaching and saying to these northern states that we are essentially a slave-holding country. So the Civil War happens, and we all know that, well, I don't know, the North wins. I don't know, like this is so different, right? Teaching or talking about these things after January 6th. I'm sorry, this is such a sidebar. But talking like doing this stuff like after January 6th, right? The first time that the rebel flag, right, is waved in the United States, right in the Capitol, it's mind-boggling, right? It's like teaching, right, thinking about like raising a flag of a rebel nation that has been defeated in the United States Capitol is mind-boggling to me, and how the connections aren't being made, that these are deliberately around racism and enslavement and kind of these thinly veiled notions of states' rights, right? they lost. Like, why would you fly a losing flag as the flag that you want to showcase to folks? But anyway, okay, that's my tangent. So, right, the South loses again, although some people might not be all the way there with this. And so we get the Civil War amendments that allow the Southern states, the former Confederacy, to then join the Union. And in order to join the Union, they had to pass the Civil War amendments. So that meant that the states needed to ratify these amendments in order to join the United States again. So the first was the 13th Amendment and outlawed slavery. The 14th reversed the Dred Scott decision and gave due process and equal protection clause. And the 15th, it said that states couldn't deny the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, right? So giving essentially just Black men the right to vote. Women don't get the right to vote to the 19th Amendment in the 1920s. So scholars argue that the Civil War amendments were doomed from the beginning for a couple of reasons. The first is that there was such tension between the president and Congress, and then the newly admitted members of Congress, right, who were former members of the Confederacy, that it just was not an ideal sustainable legislative system, right? Some other colleagues who do American political development actually show that right after the Civil War, when it was just a single party-led government, that this is where we get all these like progressive politics towards equalizing not just race, but class and gender, immigration, that happens right after the Civil War, because there's one party that is trying to govern and another party that at this time, right, the Democrats are trying to basically get their stuff together, and they're battling with white supremacy or trying to maintain white supremacy. So once really congressional reconstruction is over, this first wave, when we're seeing progressive policies that are enabling freed people to have citizenship and the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, the second part of Reconstruction, presidential Reconstruction, comes into play. And this is where President Johnson just refuses to enforce anything that Congress has passed. And instead, right, states start passing these Black codes that are really moving the formerly enslaved back into a different form of enslavement, right? Historians have called it slavery by another name. And so between this time period, Black codes are really restricting, can Black people own property? Can they own a gun? Can they live where they want, right? States like Illinois prohibit Black people from moving into the entire state, right? Indiana does the same thing later on. And then the degrees of which the harshness of how Blacks were treated vary by state. So as you might imagine, like Mississippi was one of the most harshest states for Blacks to live in. Also, Blacks had to sign legally binding labor contracts that wed them to the land, like kind of the beginning of the system of sharecropping. And also in this time is when modern day, the prison industrial complex kind of starts to build out of this nadir of Black politics, Black political life. But while all of this is happening, right, this is, I just love thinking about, talking about Black folks, right, or any really marginalized groups in America, because the resiliency of their stories have to come through, right? So it's not just a down in the dumps story. But look, right, these are the first members of Congress some of who were formerly enslaved themselves, right? Civil War veterans. And right, so they get elected to Congress. They represent Black people for a short period of time, right? I just really want to emphasize this. But it shows, right, that when Black people were given opportunity to join the polity, they do so overwhelmingly, right? Scholars have identified more than 1,500 African-American office holders during Reconstruction era, and that's between 1863 and 1877. So in that short time, right, Black folks wanted to vote. They wanted to use their political power and represent their communities. So we see this here. And because of the first era of Reconstruction, Black people really, in some places like South Carolina, where former Confederates were barred from holding office, took over political power, right? Because they had the right to do so at this point. But I also don't want us to forget about Black women, right? And the stories of which they, although they're formally excluded from the right to vote, right? Again, we don't get this until the 19th Amendment. Women get the right to vote, but fast forward, right? Black people, because of Jim Crow and poll tax, grandfather clause, all other sorts of devious ways for voter suppression, can't really vote until 1964. But Black women were suffragists. And these are names of people that are oftentimes not heard, or kind of their names aren't heralded the same way we talk about Elizabeth B. Stanton or the other white suffragists. But for example, like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, she becomes like the next celebrity of orators, right? Kind of akin to Frederick Douglass. And while she initially worked with leaders like Stanton and Anthony, she was one of the first women to call them out on their racism. Harper famously confronted Susan B. Anthony when she spoke at the 1866 Women's Rights Convention and said, you white women speak here of rights, and I speak of wrongs. This next picture is of Mary Shad Curry, who in 1874 testified before the House Judiciary Committee about the importance of the right to vote. Like, what women are doing this at this time, right? Let alone Black women. But she was legally trained, right? She's one of the first Black women to own a law degree in the United States. And she told Congress at the time that the crowning glory of the American citizenship is that it can be shared equally by people of every nationality, complexion, and race. Mary Church Terrell, who you see in the middle, she founded, along with her compadre, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, to consolidate the Black women's organizations and groups, and they founded the National Association of Colored Women. And their agenda went beyond just women's suffrage, but they also talked about job training, equal pay, educational opportunities, and childcare. And she was one of the women in Delta Sigma that marched in the Women's March in 1913, along with the newly formed sorority, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And then Ida B. Wells, as you know, probably as one of the most prominent anti-lynching activists and respected journalists of the 20th century, she was also a strident supporter of women's rights. She co-founded the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago, and that was one of the clubs that was the first Black women's suffrage organization. And it was the first organization that worked on teaching Black women about civics and advocacy of the election of Black political officials. So if it weren't for these women, the men that you saw on the previous slide would not have been elected. And so in the story that happens, right, like we know that the Compromise of 1877 really just turns the country around, right, kind of puts it back into a place where white supremacy is entrenched. So this happened because of the presidential election of 1876 with Democratic Governor Samuel Tilden, who was the governor of New York, and the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, who was governor of Ohio. And then the national agreement between the Democratic and the Republican fractions negotiated what we now call the Compromise of 1877. And this meant that the Democrats ceded the election to Hayes, and they promised to acknowledge the political rights of Black people if Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South, and promised to appropriate a portion of federal monies towards federal Southern projects, right? So like building roads and helping to build up the infrastructure. But as we know, right, that didn't happen, right? So the Democrats promised to give protections to Black folks, and they didn't. And so what you see happening is the repeal of rights to Black citizens in the South, and then the rise of these paramilitary organizations, such as the Ku Klux Klan, who really are, they're national terrorists, right? They are hurting and harming Black communities as a way to suppress their vote and their movement, their labor, their culture. And what they wanted to do was pull back what was known as the Enforcement Act of 1870. And this was an act that prohibited discrimination by state officials in voter registration on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And then this act also gave penalties for those who were found to do just that. And so these paramilitary organizations really pulled back this enforcement of the Act of 1870. And from there, we saw these restricting on voting, such as poll taxes, subjective literacy tests, strict residency requirements, and other elements that made it really difficult for laborers to satisfy. And then in the 1880s, legislation was passed almost writ large that increased the restriction of Black voters through a host of state voter restriction laws. But fast forward to some racial progress. So we're jumping up almost 100 years here. So Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which discriminates on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And this act prohibited discrimination in public accommodations and federally funded programs. And then the follow-up Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a landmark piece of legislation in the United States that prohibited racial discrimination based on voting. So here you see some pictures. So for Black politics scholars like myself, there's always this period in time where Black Americans make political strides, and then there's one step back, sometimes two steps back. And we saw this after the election of Barack Obama, right? So you get the nation's first president of African descent. And then the next president, right, is a president who is overtly playing into racism, xenophobia, and anti-Blackness, and the rise of white supremacy, right? And I share this, hopefully, that you're seeing the connections between what happens after the Civil War, right? So you get these two steps forward and then this one step back. It wasn't surprising. I'll say that, no Black politics scholars weren't like, oh man, Donald Trump, right? It was kind of like, history tells us that after some steps of racial progress. And then by all means, right, I'm not trying to equate the election of Barack Obama as being like a panacea of racial progress, but it does signal, right, that the United States at one point was willing to talk about racism and grapple with what does it mean to have a non-white male elected president. And then we get to Donald Trump. And so while Black Lives Matter, right, was actually, it comes to us, the protest movement, right, happens during the Obama years, right? Let's be real with this. But it takes off in ways that we hadn't expected, social scientists hadn't expected during the Trump years, and also continuing now, right, into the Biden years. And what this does, right, these protest movements are calling attention to racism. And so our heavily focuses on state-sponsored violence vis-a-vis the police, right? But there's all sorts of other ways that Black Lives Matter pushes us to think about the ways that the United States as an institution, as the government, right, perpetuates racism and unequal treatment for Black folks. I also want to note that it's not just in the United States. This is a global movement, right? And so there have been rallies and calls and demonstrations all throughout the world in solidarity with Blacks here in the United States, but also in their home countries. So I'm thinking of places like France or Brazil. Other thing to notice is that there are, kind of more nuanced ways of thinking about Black Lives Matter. So thinking about Black trans people that are killed, right? Particularly Black trans women who have such a high rate of murder, of very violent deaths that we in mainstream media and discourse, right, don't talk about. Oftentimes they're at the hands of Black men or right, of other lovers or family members. We also don't talk that much about Black women who are murdered by the police. So a big example is Breonna Taylor, who was murdered before George Floyd was murdered. And we got to know about her murder after the world started paying attention after George Floyd. But but this is very symptomatic of how we in the United States draw on these prototypical intersectional subjects. So those that have only one disadvantaged identity. So, right. So like thinking about how Black men in the system that is based on white patriarchy are advantaged because of are advantaged because of gender, but are disadvantaged because of race, but not thinking about people that have doubly marginalized identities like race and gender or sexual orientation or lower income status, right? Like that's oftentimes not the face that we go to. So to put this in context for you, BLM is this intersectional movement. So there should be conversations, right? There are conversations around those other intersecting notions, right? Of gender, of class, sexuality, sexual orientation, and identity. And this is an idea, right, that state-sponsored violence is more than just police killings, but it's other ways that Black individuals are devalued in all across society, right? So a Black Lives Matter issue would be the continuing water crisis in Flint, Michigan, right? You take the city that is majority Black, who is dealing with unsafe water due to state policy, right? Or the continued undereducation, underfunding of certain schools because of the districts that they're in, the neighborhoods that they're in, and how they're funded, right? That does violence to students because of their socioeconomic status, and oftentimes is mapped on to their race. My own research wants to locate Black women within this long trajectory of activism. I'll talk to you a little bit about my research. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is an international movement, and that women, particularly Black women in France, are leading this Black Lives Matter protest. And these are women that are similar to the United States who have lost family members because of state-sponsored violence. So whether they are a mother, a sister, a grandmother, right, someone who has some kind of familiar relationship to Black people who were lost to the state-sponsored violence. So it's very similar as women who are reacting out of this nurturer caretaker role as being the ones to stand up for their family members and community members after they have died. So these are just a slide of some photos of names that I'm sure Black people that you're familiar with. So Rakia Boyd, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Ayanna Stanley Jones, and Michael Brown, right? And these slogans that we see about like hands up, don't shoot, or that white silence is violence. These are things that Black Lives Matter has brought attention to through social media, demonstration, and other protest tactics that really call to the fore, right, deaths of Black Americans. As both the social media hashtag and the actual organization, Black Lives Matter is critical and crucial intervention into state-sponsored violence against Black populations. And again, by state-sponsored violence, I'm not only mentioning the killings of Blacks by police, but also the systematic ways in which populations are devalued across various domains and societies. And you might remember this kind of becoming popular in 2014 after the death of Michael Brown, who was you see in the middle here with the graduation cap and gown on, an 18-year-old African-American recent high school graduate by a white police officer, Darren Wilson, in Ferguson, Missouri, which is a suburb of St. Louis. And I'll talk a little bit about that based on my own research in the next coming slides. So although this becomes popular in 2014, the phrase starts generating kind of popular among Black Twitter and Black activists in 2012 after Trayvon Martin is murdered by George Zimmerman and he is acquitted. And the things to remember here about what happened to Trayvon Martin is that Trayvon Martin, right, kind of gets put on the stand, right? The prosecution really wants to demonize or think about Trayvon Martin as some kind of threat to this neighborhood, and that George Zimmerman's actions have to be warranted because Trayvon Martin is this threat. But although Trayvon Martin, right, wasn't on the stand, right, it was George Zimmerman, right, we don't really get the kind of complexities of who George Zimmerman was. And now, like talking about this, years later, almost 10 years later, a decade later, right, talking this with my students, right, and thinking about all like the warnings and red flag signs that George Zimmerman was just like a bad person, is apparent if he uses intersectional lens, right? So he's been found to have sexually assaulted his family members. He's had guns and have done, really terrifying bad things to people in his life. He should not have had a firearm, right? All of these things later come up later on. And when I share this with my students, I share that listening to the voices of women who were raising alarms about George Zimmerman to public officials went unheard. And so the same way that I'm thinking about racism as being endemic to the United States, so is patriarchy, right? So is thinking about women as having the subservient role to men, right? And that these women aren't believed. And that there's actually calls to curtail George Zimmerman's access to firearms because of what he had previously done that go unheard because they're raised by women. All right, so what does Black Lives Matter, right? It's a term that's coined by a professor here, Marcus Anthony Hunter, who is a sociologist at UCLA. But the hashtag and social movement, right, is founded in 2014 by three Black feminists, queer Black feminists. And it's this grassroots organization that is group-centered and it's not leader-driven. So unlike the civil rights movement, right, where you see like Martin Luther King, or you're thinking about the Black Power movement and you think of Malcolm X, right? You don't probably think about the founders of Black Lives Matter, Garza, Colors, and Tometi, because it's not a personality-centered movement, right? It's really group-centered, and there are different chapters in states that are really led in this kind of like grassroots movement, as opposed from this top-down leadership model. So I talked a little bit about St. Louis and Ferguson. I showed these pictures here because I did some research here that I would, it's been too long. I need to get this published. But these are pictures from the city council meetings after Mike Brown was killed. And I did research here because I used to teach at St. Louis University. So this was part of my like larger community, right? I'm trying to help make sense as a social scientist, like what's happening here. And as you see in this picture, there's a Black man kind of getting in the face of a council member, but the Ferguson council was majority white. And here you see it further down in the line, there's a Black woman here who is this one seat out of the several that are belonging to white people. And the Ferguson population is majority Black. And what the Ferguson residents are saying is, why doesn't our council reflect who we are, right? Why aren't there more Black representatives on this council? And if there are, what might that look like? And here on this other picture, you see Black Lives Matter protesters taking over the city council, right? And really demanding that there be some changes made, right? So in a city that's majority Black, there is not Black political representation. And would Mike Brown's murder and subsequent acquittal or non-indictment of Darren Wilson happen if there were Black representation? And so in my own research, what I show is that Black women really took this upon themselves. So here's a picture at the front of Cori Bush, who at the time was just a protester, right? An organizer who was out in the streets in Ferguson and in St. Louis trying to have demands of this community known and really take care of young people. And when I interviewed now Congresswoman Cori Bush, one of the things that stuck out to me in our conversation is she said she was there every night, right? On kind of like the main strip in Florissant. It was just the road where the protests were happening. And she wondered, where was Lacy Clay? This is a Black man representative who was part of his father was the first Black representative from Missouri, went on to co-found the Congressional Black Caucus. But Lacy Clay wasn't anywhere to be found, right after Mike Brown was murdered. And there was civil unrest happening in his city, in his district, and he wasn't there. And Cori Bush mentioned this to me, right? And in the interview. And in her thought process, she's like, Black women, me, are doing the work that elected officials should be doing. So why shouldn't we be the elected officials? We are caring and compassionate about our community. And we're doing this because we want to bring healing. We want to see our children do better. We should be in the halls of Congress, not those who come for a photo op or want to have leadership positions and not necessarily change the material realities on the ground. Cori Bush was unsuccessful the first time, ran again, and beat Lacey Clay. And so now you've probably seen her as part of this progressive wing of the Democratic Party, who is really pushing Congress on some of the progressive promises that I think many people believe the Democrats would bring in to power through policy. The bottom two pictures are good stories. So when I met these two women, they were city council members. Now one is mayor, so the first Black woman mayor of Ferguson, another is still a city council member. But these conversations, right, that I had with these then council members really talked to like the different sensibilities that Black women bring as elected officials, right, that they, again, like kind of echoing Cori Bush, weren't in this for the me, they were in this for the we. And it's a different kind of ethos of thinking about Black women as being socialized to take care of everyone else first and then take care of yourself. But if you're taking care of everyone, should you or could you not do this in different ways, right? Could you do this in not just being a mother, or just being a teacher, or just being a grandmother or a nurse, right? But could you also do these things in elected government? And those are some of the things that these women shared with me. I'll call your attention to this resource, and I can, if you're interested, I can share some of these articles with you. But right after George Floyd was murdered, colleagues and I put together a Black Lives Matter syllabus, a set of readings that were ungated for people to read social science scholarship on how do we make sense of Black Lives Matter. And what these essays did was they touched on forms of police brutality, lack of economic and educational opportunities, environmental racism, such as housing and food insecurities, and gender-based violence as all housing within like structural racism and how Black Lives Matter is framed. So I'm happy to share these or specific articles if you're interested. So some of the last points I want to make here is that I think we need to really expand the way that we're thinking intersectionally, right? So intersectionality marries both multiple identities, so being multiply salient identities, right? So your race, your gender, your class, your sexual orientation, nativity, language spoken, religiosity, marrying all of these things with also understanding structures and institutions that you're placed in, and then how these things create different cases or needs to understand what's happening in the world. And so I draw on intersectionality theory to think about how sometimes the concerns and politics of women of color, particularly Black women, aren't seen. And what I want to hopefully do with some other work is show this comparison again between France and the United States about how Black women's experiences in activism are similar and dissimilar. So to conclude, right, I think that we take a page out of some of our forefathers, our Black foremothers and forefathers, to say like we celebrate America, right? We want to be a part of the polity. We want America to live up to the things, the ideals that she says she is. But to do that, we have to push her to be better. We have to push her to be, right? To be all the things that we want that to be. And this means asking some of the hard questions. This means being uncomfortable. This means talking about racism, right? Nothing is wrong with race, right? Like God has given us, right, a different set of physical attributes, but that doesn't mean that someone is less than or better than. That's humans, right? That is the things that we bring to us through society. And that's what we want America to be better about. And just as, right, once Black people got the chance to serve America by running for office, they did so. these conversations around race and racism have to happen because this group of people is even more dedicated, perhaps, to the American ideals and way of life, right? Than those who are seeking to destroy it. And I say this again, I'm kind of given this, I'll stop here, kind of given this talk as a, post January 6th, like this is just so different, right? Because the work or the ways that we see marginalized groups, and I'm thinking in particular about like new immigrant populations, as well as, Black people and other queer folks and marginalized folks that are fighting for inclusion in the policy, aren't telling America like, go away, goddamn, right? They're saying, I came here because I want to be an American, or I am here, right? Like I didn't come here like I'm Black, right? Or like I'm Native, right? Like I'm here, but I want America to live up to these things, right? And saying that these groups of people are anti-American because they're talking about how they're treated or showing some of like the discrepancies between how they're treated and the ideals is actually an opportunity for us to have larger conversations about how can America be better than trying to suppress these things. So again, I want to be able to share with you all like tools on how to have these conversations based in like social science, not based on opinion, not based on, listening to Fox News or MSNBC, but actually like how are scholars thinking about this and what does social science have to offer?